I stopped at a small grocery store in town to buy a bottle of sweet tea and saw a young woman working behind the counter. A customer laughed. Someone like her will never have a better life. I ignored him until she looked up at me. I froze when I saw my daughter's exact eyes and the familiar silver bracelet on her wrist. She was my daughter, the child I believed was gone after what my stepwife told me. But the truth was finally beginning to emerge. Thank you so much for joining Dad's Revenge Stories today. I appreciate each of you. Let me know in the comments below, where in the world are you watching from? Note this narrative blends dramatized creative elements for entertainment purposes. While characters are coincidental, the life lesson conveyed is very real and useful. I have driven this stretch of highway between Nashville and Millbrook so many times that I could probably do it with my eyes closed. 230 miles of Tennessee back roads, pine trees pressing up against both shoulders, the kind of drive that gives a man too much time to think. On most days, I turn the radio up loud enough to keep the thoughts at bay. That evening in August, the radio had been off since Cookeville. I was tired. Not the kind of tired that a good night's sleep fixes the other kind. The kind that settles into your bones after 20 years of building something enormous and beautiful and completely hollow at the center. Harmon Development had 17 offices across 8 states. I had a house in Nashville with 11 rooms and a housekeeper named Betty who left dinner in the oven every night whether I came home or not. I had more money than I would ever spend and less reason to spend it than I had ever had in my life. I pulled off at Millbrook just after 6 in the evening. The gas gauge was not low enough to justify stopping, but my back ached and my eyes burned, and there was a small grocery on the main strip that had a hand-painted sign in the window advertising fresh, sweet tea. I am a grown man with a driver and a personal assistant and 3 corporate credit cards, and I stopped for sweet tea because the sign reminded me of something I could not quite name. The store was called Callaway's. The bell above the door announced me to nobody in particular. The interior smelled like wood polish and oranges and something baked cinnamon maybe or nutmeg. Shelves ran the length of both walls crowded with canned goods and local honey and handmade preserves with handwritten labels. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. The whole place felt like it had been built sometime in 1987 and had simply decided not to change. I grabbed a bottle of sweet tea from the cooler near the back and stood for a moment, rolling the cold glass against the side of my neck. That was when I heard her voice. "Sir, if you're looking for the local preserves, the blackberry just came in yesterday. Best batch Ruth's had in years." I turned around. She was standing behind the counter maybe 20 feet away, wiping down the surface with a blue cloth. Early 30s, I guessed. Dark hair pulled back. A plain green apron over a white shirt. She was not looking at me. She was focused on a stubborn spot near the register, pressing into it with more determination than the task really required. A man in a wrinkled polo shirt was leaning against the far end of the counter, the kind of man who took up more space than he needed, and spoke at a volume that assumed everyone wanted to hear him. He was looking at Sarah with the particular contempt of someone who had decided without any real information exactly what kind of person she was. "So you know," he said loud enough that I could hear him clearly from the door. "A girl working a register in a place like this at your age, that's just about as good as it gets for you, isn't it?" He said it like a joke, but his eyes were not laughing. Some people just hit their ceiling early. Sarah did not look up from the counter. She finished wiping the spot near the register with the same steady pressure she had been applying before he opened his mouth, set the cloth down, and said in a voice that was entirely level, "Will that be all for you today, sir?" The man laughed a short, dismissive sound and dropped some cash on the counter and walked out. The bell above the door rang behind him. Sarah picked up the cash-made change into the register and went back to straightening the display of local honey without any visible sign that the exchange had affected her. But I had been watching her hands. They were very still, too still. The stillness of someone who had learned through long practice to keep everything they felt below the surface where no casual observer would think to look. I would tell you I noticed her eyes first. That would make for a better story. The truth is that I noticed her wrist. I would tell you I noticed her eyes first. That would make for a better story. The truth is that I noticed her wrist. She reached across the counter to straighten a small display of local honey, and her sleeve pulled back 2 inches, and I saw it. A bracelet. Silver thin with a small crescent moon charm that had been worn smooth on one side from years of contact with skin. My sweet tea hit the floor. The bottle did not break Tennessee hardwood solid as bedrock, but the sound brought her eyes up to my face, and I wish I could describe what happened to me in that moment in clinical terms. I wish I could say my heart rate elevated or that I experienced a cognitive disruption. The truth is that my chest cracked open like something had been living inside it for 20 years and had finally decided it was done waiting. Those eyes, gray-blue wide with a slight downward tilt at the outer corners, that gave her a permanent expression of careful attention. I had looked at those eyes in a framed photograph on my desk every single day for 2 decades. I had looked at them in my dreams. I had looked at them in the faces of strangers on the street, in airports, in restaurants, in parking lots, and felt the particular cruelty of being wrong every single time. Sir, her voice carried a thread of concern. Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. I bent down and picked up the tea. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had to press the bottle against my thigh to steady it. I'm fine, I said. My voice came out lower and rougher than I intended. I'm sorry. I'm that bracelet. She glanced down at her wrist. Her expression shifted into something more guarded, not unfriendly, but careful. The way a person looks when a stranger asks about something personal. What about it? She asked. Where did you get it? A pause. She set the cloth down on the counter. When she looked back up at me, there was something behind her eyes that I could not read, not fear exactly, but a kind of long-practiced wariness that did not belong on the face of someone her age. It belonged to my mother, she said. She left it to me when she passed. The breath I had been holding left my body in one long, unsteady exhale. My chest ached with a pressure I had not felt in years. What was your mother's name? I asked. The question came out quieter than I intended, almost gentle. She studied me for a long moment. The ceiling fan turned. Somewhere in the back of the store, a refrigeration unit hummed. Diane, she said. Her name was Diane. The world did not tilt. The floor did not drop out from under me. Everything in Callaway's grocery stayed exactly where it was: the honey, the preserves, the hand-painted sign, the slow fan overhead. Everything stayed perfectly still, while something inside me that had been frozen for 20 years cracked straight down the middle. Diane. I had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to forget that name. I had built an empire partly in the effort of forgetting it. I had donated to charities, worked 18-hour days, flown to cities. I had no real reason to visit all of it, every last hour of it, at least partly in service of not thinking about the woman who had stood beside me at a graveside and wept with what I had believed with my whole broken heart was genuine grief. Are you sure you're okay? The young woman asked. Her voice had softened slightly, though the wariness had not left her eyes. I apologize, I said. I set the tea on the nearest shelf because I did not trust my hands with it anymore. I think I need some air. I walked out of Callaway's grocery. and stood on the sidewalk in the warm August evening and looked at the mountains going purple in the distance, and thought about a little girl who had been 12 years old the last time I saw her face. A little girl I had buried in a cemetery on a Tuesday morning in March 20 years ago, while the woman who called herself her stepmother stood beside me and held my hand. I stood there for a long time. Then I went back inside and bought the sweet tea, because I was not ready to leave. Not yet. Not until I knew her name. She was watching me when I walked back in. Not obviously, she had picked up the cloth again and was making herself look busy near the register, but I caught it. The way her eyes flicked up and then away the moment I pushed through the door. 20 years of reading boardrooms full of people who did not want me to know what they were thinking had made me good at catching the moments people tried to hide. I set a second bottle of sweet tea on the counter, even though I had not finished the first one. "I'll take one of those blackberry preserves too," I said, "and whatever else you'd recommend." She looked at me for a moment with an expression that sat somewhere between amusement and suspicion. Then she reached under the counter and produced a small jar of honey with a handwritten label that read Clover Hill Millbrook TN. "Local beekeeper 3 miles out," she said. "Best honey in 4 counties. People drive up from Knoxville for it." "I believe you," I said. I handed her a 20 and watched her make change with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years. Her hands were steady where mine were not. I noticed the small callus on her right index finger, the kind that comes from writing by hand, not from typing. Claire had been left-handed, but she had always held her pencil wrong, pressing too hard, and she had built up the same callus in the same place by the time she was 10 years old. I was doing it again, cataloging, comparing, building a case inside my own chest that my brain had not yet given me permission to believe. "I didn't catch your name," I said. She counted out my change and placed it on the counter rather than into my palm. Another careful move. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Mills." "Gerald Harmon." I left the change where she had put it. "I'm sorry about earlier. The bracelet caught me off guard. It looks like one I had made for someone a long time ago." Sarah Mills looked at the bracelet on her wrist. For just a moment, barely 2 seconds, something moved across her face. Not recognition. Closer to an old ache that she had learned to carry so quietly, she almost forgot it was there. "My mother didn't talk much about where she got it," she said. Her voice had gone carefully neutral. "She didn't talk much about a lot of things." "I'm sorry she passed," I said. "It was a while ago." She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed into smoothness. The words had no edges left on them. The bell above the door rang, and a man came in, tall, maybe 30, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work, rather than a gym membership. He wore a gray t-shirt with the name of an auto shop printed across the chest, and he moved through the store with the ease of someone who had been coming here his whole life. He pulled a cold drink from the cooler, glanced at me once with a look that was polite on the surface, and something considerably more alert underneath, then positioned himself at the far end of the counter. "So everything good, Sarah?" he asked. His voice was easy, casual, but his eyes did not leave my face. "Fine, Noah," she said. "Just helping a customer." Noah. He gave me one more measured look, then turned his attention to the label on his drink, with the deliberate nonchalance of someone who had decided to stay close without making it obvious. I picked up my purchases and turned toward the door. At the threshold, I stopped and looked back at her. I could not help it, the same way you cannot help pressing on a bruise just to confirm it is real. Sarah Mills was already watching me. She stood very still behind the counter with one hand resting flat on the wooden surface, and her gray-blue eyes tracking me with an expression I had not seen on an adult face in a very long time. It was the look of someone trying to place a voice they had heard before in a dream reaching for something just beyond the edge of memory, not sure whether finding it would be a relief or something worse. I had seen that look once before, in a mirror, every morning for 20 years. "You take care now, Mr. Harmon," she said. "You too, Sarah," I said. I walked out into the warm evening and kept walking until I reached my car. I sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. The mountains had gone from purple to gray. The hand-painted sign in Callaway's window glowed faintly in the last of the daylight. The bracelet had been custom-made. I had commissioned it from a jeweler on Fifth Avenue in Nashville for Claire's 12th birthday. 3 weeks before the morning, Diane had loaded her into a car and driven away, and called me 40 minutes later with a voice so steady it should have told me everything. The crescent moon charm had been Claire's idea. She had gone through a phase of drawing moons in the margins of her school books, on the backs of her hands, on the condensation of cold windows. No jeweler made two of those, not identical, not with that particular worn smoothness on the left side of the charm. I pulled out my phone and sat with it in my hand for a full minute before I made the call. When the line connected, I did not bother with a greeting. "Alan," I said, "I need you." I did not go back to Nashville that night. I checked into the only motel Millbrook had to offer, a 12-room place called the Pineview that smelled like cedar and old carpet, and had a vending machine in the hallway that dispensed nothing but cheerwine and pork rinds. I lay on top of the bedspread with my shoes still on, and stared at a water stain on the ceiling, and let the memories come. I had spent 20 years learning to hold them at arm's length. That night in Millbrook, with Sarah Mills's gray-blue eyes still burning behind my own, I did not have the strength to keep them back anymore. Claire had been 12 years old the last morning I saw her alive. She had been eating cereal at the kitchen counter, the sugary kind that Diane hated, and that I kept buying anyway, because Claire's face when she found a new box in the pantry was one of the best things in my life. She was wearing a yellow backpack, and her hair was in a ponytail that was already half falling out, and she was reading the back of the cereal box with the focused intensity she brought to everything. She looked up when I came in and gave me the grin that showed the gap where her left canine had not fully grown in yet. She said, "Did you know that a group of flamingos is called a flamboyance?" "I did not know that," I said. "That's the best word ever invented." I kissed the top of her head. I told her to have a good day. I went to work. That was the last conversation I ever had with my daughter. Diane called me at 11:47 that morning. I remember the time because I had been in the middle of a conference call, and I stepped out of the room to answer, irritated at the interruption. Her voice was steady, measured. She told me there had been an accident on Route 9. She told me Claire had been in the car. She told me the paramedics had done everything they could. I have no memory of driving to the hospital. I have no memory of parking the car or walking through the emergency room doors. My first clear memory is a doctor I had never seen before, a man with a gray beard and rimless glasses handing me a folder of paperwork and speaking in the careful monotone of someone who had delivered this kind of news many times and had learned to keep his own feelings entirely out of it. The paperwork had Claire's name on it. It had a time of death. It had a signature. I signed where they told me to sign. The funeral was 4 days later. I remember standing at the graveside in a dark suit that Betty had pressed for me, and I remember the pastor speaking, and I remember Diane beside me with her hand in mine, her grip firm and steady where I could not stop shaking. People from the neighborhood came. People from my office came. Everyone brought food afterward. The house was full of casseroles for a week. Margaret came. My younger sister drove up from Chattanooga and sat with me in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone home. She did not try to tell me it would get easier. She did not quote scripture or offer perspective or do any of the things people do when they do not know what else to do. She just sat with me, which was why I had always loved her more than I could properly say. But before she left that evening, she pulled me aside near the back door. Her voice dropped low enough that Diane in the next room could not have heard. "Ah, Gerald," she said. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was controlled in a way that made me pay attention. "Something about today doesn't sit right with me. Diane was—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. She was too calm. From the moment I got here. I've been watching her, and she hasn't cried once. Not once, Gerald. I remember that my first feeling was anger. Not at Diane. At Margaret. People grieve differently, I said. I know that. Margaret grabbed my arm before I could turn away. I know that. But it's more than the crying. It's the way she's been organizing things. The flowers, the schedule, the thank you cards already sitting on the desk. It feels like someone running an event they planned in advance. I pulled my arm free. I told her she was exhausted and grieving and reading things into nothing. I told her to drive safe back to Chattanooga. She looked at me for a long moment, with an expression I would not understand for 20 years. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, Gerald." She hugged me and she left. I lay in that Millbrook motel room and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until I saw white. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. The vending machine hummed in the hallway. Somewhere outside, a truck downshifted on the highway, and the sound faded into the Tennessee dark. For 20 years, I had carried Margaret's words like a stone I refused to look at directly. I had told myself she was wrong. I had told myself grief made people look for explanations where there were none. I had built an empire on the foundation of keeping myself too busy to hear her voice in the back of my mind. That night in the Pineview Motel, with Sarah Mills's face behind my eyes and a bracelet I had commissioned on Fifth Avenue sitting on a stranger's wrist in a grocery store 3 blocks away, I finally stopped pretending. Margaret had not been wrong. She had never been wrong. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and pulled up her number. It was nearly midnight. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had not been sleeping either. "Gerald," she said, "just my name." But the way she said it, like she had been waiting for this call for a very long time, cracked something open in my chest that I was not sure I would be able to close again. "Margaret," I said. "I think I found her." I did not sleep. I lay in that motel room until the sky outside the curtains went from black to gray to the pale, watery blue of an early Tennessee morning, and then I sat up, put my feet on the floor, and called Alan Marsh. Alan picked up on the first ring. It was 6:14 in the morning. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said. That was Alan. No hello, no how are you. No acknowledgement that it was barely past dawn. 22 years of working investigations, first as a detective with the Metro Nashville Police Department, then on his own after what he called a difference of professional opinion with his captain, had stripped away everything he considered unnecessary, and pleasantries were at the top of that list. "I need you in Millbrook," I said. "Today." "Tell me why." I told him about the bracelet. I told him about Sarah Mills and her gray-blue eyes, and the way she had said the name Diane with the flattened affect of someone who had learned not to feel things too deeply around that particular word. I told him about the crescent moon charm worn smooth on the left side. When I finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that I checked my screen to make sure the call had not dropped. "Alan," I said. "I'm here." His voice had shifted into a register I recognized, quieter, more deliberate, the tone he used when something had moved from routine to serious. "Gerald, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without interrupting me. Go ahead. I worked the initial investigation in 2005, he said. The accident on Route 9. I was the responding detective. I had not known that. In 20 years, it had never come up. I gripped the phone tighter. I had questions from the beginning, Alan continued. The accident scene did not match the witness account. The physical evidence was inconsistent with the reported speed and point of impact. I started pulling on those threads, and within 48 hours I got a call from my captain, telling me the case was closed. Accidental death, no further investigation required. Someone pressured him, I said. Someone paid him, Alan said. I never proved it. I didn't have enough before they shut me down. I filed an internal objection, which disappeared into the bureaucratic equivalent of a black hole, and 6 months later I handed in my badge because I could not keep working in a department where that was possible. He paused. I have been waiting 20 years for a reason to finish what I started. My throat was tight enough that I had to work to get the words out. Why didn't you come to me? Because I had nothing concrete, he said. A hunch and a closed file don't hold up in court or in conversation. I needed you to have a reason to look before I gave you a direction to look in. Otherwise, I'm just a former cop telling a grieving father that his daughter's death might not have been an accident, and that kind of information without evidence doesn't help anyone. It just destroys people. I stood up from the edge of the bed and walked to the window. Outside, Millbrook was waking up slowly. A pickup truck rolled past on the main strip, and 2 doors down from the motel, someone was unlocking the front door of a diner. The world going about its ordinary business, while mine tilted on its axis. What do you need from me? I asked. Access, he said. Financial records, medical records, anything connected to Diane from 2004 through 2006. And I need the name of the doctor who signed Claire's death certificate. I have the paperwork at the house in Nashville. I never threw any of it away. I had never been able to explain that to myself, why I had kept every document from the worst period of my life. Maybe some part of me had always known I would need them. Good, Alan said. One more thing. Another pause, longer this time. Gerald, before I drive to Millbrook, I need you to answer me honestly. Are you sure you want to know what I find? Because if that girl is who you think she is, what comes next will not be simple. It will not be quiet. And it will cost you things you have not prepared yourself to lose. I looked out at Calloway's grocery at the far end of the block, the hand-painted sign in the window, the lights not yet on inside. Somewhere behind that door, a young woman named Sarah Mills was starting her morning without knowing that a man she had never met was standing in a motel window 200 yards away, shaking with something that was equal parts terror and hope. I'm sure, I said. Then I'll be there by noon, Alan said. Don't approach the girl again before I arrive. And Gerald, don't tell anyone else what you've told me. Not yet. I agreed. I ended the call and stood at the window until the lights came on inside Calloway's, and a figure moved behind the glass, and I made myself turn away before I could confirm whether it was her. Some things Alan had taught me a long time ago were better approached with patience than urgency. I had already waited 20 years. I could wait until noon. Alan arrived at the Pineview at 12:05 in a dusty Ford pickup that looked like it had survived 2 decades of hard use and several poor decisions. He was a compact man in his early 50s, gray at the temples with the kind of face that did not give much away unless he wanted it to. We sat in my room for an hour while I told him everything from the beginning. He took notes on a small spiral pad and asked questions that were precise and unhurried and occasionally uncomfortable. When I finished, he closed the pad and told me to go to Nashville and get every document I had from 2005. He would start working Millbrook from his end. I was back on the highway by 2 in the afternoon. Margaret lived in a craftsman bungalow on the east side of Nashville, 12 minutes from my house, and a different world entirely. Where my place ran to marble floors and rooms nobody used, Margaret's had bookshelves on every wall and a porch swing that needed repainting, and a vegetable garden along the south side that she tended with more dedication than I had ever given anything that did not generate revenue. She had taught 8th grade English for 31 years. She had never married. She had always seemed to me like someone who had found the shape of the life she wanted and simply lived inside it without apology. She was waiting on the porch when I pulled up. She had a mug of coffee in both hands, and she was watching me park with an expression that was careful and tender and frightened all at once. I got out of the car, and she crossed the porch in 4 steps and put her arms around me before I could say a word. She was smaller than me by nearly a foot, and she held on with a fierceness that made my eyes burn. "How certain are you?" she asked into my shoulder. "Certain enough that I couldn't sleep," I said. "Certain enough that I called Alan Marsh at 6 in the morning." She pulled back and looked at my face. Whatever she saw there settled something in her expression. She nodded once and said, "Come inside." She led me through the kitchen and down the short hallway to the back bedroom she used as a study. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a reading chair by the window, a desk buried under student papers she would never stop grading even in retirement. And in the corner behind the door, a wooden chest I had not seen in years. "I kept everything," Margaret said. She was watching me look at the chest. Her voice was steady, but her hands were wrapped tight around the coffee mug. "I know you told me to donate it after the first year. I know you said you couldn't look at it anymore." She paused. "I lied to you, Gerald. I told you I'd taken it to Goodwill. I couldn't do it." I crossed the room and crouched in front of the chest. The latch was a simple brass hook. My fingers did not want to work properly. "I'm glad you lied," I said. I opened it. The smell hit me first. That particular combination of cedar and childhood that I had not encountered in 2 decades, and it reached into my chest and grabbed something that had been numb for a very long time. Claire's yellow raincoat was folded on top. Beneath it, a stack of school books, with her name written inside the front covers in the oversized, careful handwriting of a child who had recently been taught cursive and was still proud of it. A shoebox of drawings. A purple stuffed elephant with one ear almost completely detached from years of being carried everywhere. I sat down on the floor. I did not plan to. My legs simply made the decision without consulting me. Margaret sat in the reading chair and did not say anything. She understood, as she always had, the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed protecting. I went through the chest slowly. At the bottom, beneath the drawings and the school books and a spelling bee ribbon from 2nd grade, I found a small notebook with a green cover. Claire had written her name on the front in red marker, surrounded by hand-drawn moons in various phases. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had trouble opening it. The early pages were exactly what you would expect from a 12-year-old: observations about school complaints, about homework, enthusiastic reviews of movies and breakfast cereals, a running list of words she found interesting. Flamboyance was on the list. I had to press the back of my hand against my mouth when I saw it. I turned to the last entry. The handwriting was slightly less careful than the earlier pages, like she had written quickly or in poor light. "Tuesday, can't sleep. I heard Diane on the phone tonight after Dad went to bed. She was in the kitchen talking really quietly, but I was on the stairs and I could hear her. She said everything is ready for tomorrow. I don't know who she was talking to or what's ready, but her voice was weird. Not like normal. Like when people try to sound calm, but they're actually really not. I don't want to tell Dad because maybe it's nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like something I wasn't supposed to hear. The entry ended there. Tomorrow had been the day of the accident. I read the entry 3 times. My chest ached with a pressure that had no clean release, not grief exactly, not anger exactly, but something that contained both and went deeper than either. She had known. My 12-year-old daughter had known that something was wrong, and she had lain awake trying to decide whether to tell me, and by morning it had been too late. Gerald. Margaret's voice was very gentle. What does it say? I looked up at her. My face was wet, and I had not noticed until that moment. She heard Diane on the phone the night before, I said. She wrote it down. Margaret set her coffee mug on the floor beside the chair. Her hands were trembling now, too. That's evidence, she said quietly. Yes, I said. It is. I closed the notebook carefully and held it in both hands like something irreplaceable. Because it was. Alan called 48 hours later. I was sitting at the desk in my home office in Nashville, surrounded by the files I had pulled from the storage boxes in the basement. Everything from 2004 through 2006, 2 decades of paperwork I had carried from house to house without ever opening. The death certificate was there. The hospital intake forms were there. The accident report from the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department was there 4 pages long with Alan's own signature on the 3rd page in handwriting that was younger and less careful than it was now. I had read everything twice. I had not found what I was looking for, which was a single detail that did not hold together under pressure. There were several. Talk to me, I said when I picked up. I've been busy, Alan said. You're going to want to write this down. I already had a pen in my hand. Go ahead. I started with the hospital, he said. Millbrook General processed the accident call on the morning of March 14, 2005. I pulled their intake logs for that date through a contact in the county records office. Gerald, there is no record of Claire Harmon being admitted, treated, or pronounced at that facility. Not under her name. Not under any name matching her description. The emergency room intake log for that entire morning has 4 entries, and none of them are her. I pressed the pen hard enough against the notepad that it tore through the paper. The hospital paperwork Diane gave me was not generated by that hospital, Alan said. The formatting is close, but the employee ID numbers on the admission forms don't match any staff on record for that period. Whoever made those documents knew enough to be convincing, but not enough to be perfect. He paused. I also ran the doctor who signed the death certificate. A man named William Carver listed as attending physician. I remember the name, I said. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. William Carver surrendered his medical license to the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners in September 2005, Alan said. 6 months after signing that certificate. The board's records show the surrender was voluntary, which typically means they were about to pull it anyway, and the doctor got ahead of the process. What the public records don't show, but what a former colleague of Carver's told me this morning over coffee in Brentwood, is that Carver bought a house in Costa Rica in August 2005 and relocated there permanently. Cash purchase, approximately $400,000. The number landed in my chest, like something physical. In America, a physician cannot simply abandon their license and leave the country without consequence, unless there is no active criminal investigation compelling them to stay. Carver had timed his departure carefully after the paperwork was filed after the case was closed, before anyone thought to ask questions. It was the move of someone who had been paid well and advised well, and had no intention of being available for follow-up. The witness, I said. Earl Briggs. Earl Briggs. Alan confirmed. Currently resides in a waterfront condominium in Clearwater, Florida. I found him through property records. The condo was purchased in late 2005 for $310,000. Earl Briggs, at the time of the accident, was listed in the sheriff's report as a retired mechanic with a fixed income. Another pause. Retired mechanics with fixed incomes do not typically purchase waterfront condominiums in Clearwater. I stood up from the desk. I could not sit still any longer. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard. The garden Betty kept trimmed the oak tree Claire had climbed every summer until she was too old to think it was still something children did, and still too young to stop wanting to. "Someone paid them both," I said. "Someone paid them both." Alan agreed. "Carver got $400,000. Briggs got $310. That's over $700,000 to make a 12-year-old girl disappear on paper." He let that settle for a moment. "I traced both payments through 3 shell companies before the trail went cold, but I got far enough to identify the originating account." My hand tightened on the phone. "Alan." "The account was registered to a limited liability company incorporated in Delaware in 2003, he said. "Delaware is a common incorporation state because the disclosure requirements are minimal. You can form an LLC there without publicly identifying the owners, which makes it attractive for people who want financial privacy." He cleared his throat. "The registered agent for the LLC is a law firm in Nashville that I am still working to tie directly to your family. But the company name is already on record." "What's the name?" I asked. A brief pause. I could hear Alan turning a page in his spiral notebook. "PH Capital Group," he said. I had seen that name before. It had been on a contract that crossed my desk 18 months ago, a contract I had signed without reading closely, because Preston had told me it was a routine vendor agreement, and I had trusted him. Preston Harmon. PH. The pen in my hand dropped to the floor. I did not bend down to pick it up. I stood at the window with the phone pressed against my ear and looked at the oak tree in the backyard and felt something shift inside me that I knew with absolute certainty was never going to shift back. "Gerald," Alan said carefully, "are you still with me?" "I'm here," I said. My voice surprised me. It was very calm. The way things go calm sometimes just before they break completely. "Star Preston," I said, not a question. "I can't confirm the beneficial ownership yet," Alan said. "But yes, that's where it's pointing. I had bought that boy his first car. I had taught him to drive it in the parking lot of a church on a Sunday morning when the lot was empty. I had written the recommendation letter that got him into Vanderbilt. I had given him a corner office and a salary that most men his age spent a decade working toward. And for 20 years, he had known exactly where my daughter was. Preston Harmon was 10 years old when his mother married me. He was a quiet kid back then. Skinny, serious, with Diane's dark eyes and a habit of watching adults from across the room before deciding whether they were worth approaching. I had respected that about him. I had taken it as evidence of intelligence rather than calculation, which is the kind of mistake you make when you want something to be true badly enough. I had wanted a son. That was the plain fact of it. Claire had been the center of my world, but she was gone, and I was a man in his mid-40s with a company and a house, and a particular hollowness that grief carves into a person, and that nothing seems to fill properly afterward. Preston had been there. He had needed things, guidance, attention, a steady presence, and I had needed somewhere to put the love that had nowhere left to go. I had driven him to his first job interview when he was 19, coaching him on the way about how to read the room before speaking. I had sat in the back row at his college graduation, with the same feeling I imagined real fathers carried into those auditoriums, something warm and unearned and quietly devastating. because I had wanted it to be real so badly that I had simply decided it was. I had given him a corner office at Harmon Development when he was 26. I had introduced him to clients as my stepson. I had defended him in meetings when senior staff questioned his judgment, because I had believed his judgment was sound, and because I had not wanted to consider the alternative. I put the phone down after Alan's call and sat very still at my desk for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the internal email archive for Harmon Development. In America, corporate email systems maintained by a company's own servers are legally accessible to the company's owner and executive leadership without a warrant or court order. The emails belong to the company, not to the individual employee, a fact that is disclosed in every employment agreement we issued. Preston had signed that agreement. I had signed the policy myself. I typed his name into the search field and set the date range from January 2022 to the present, and waited while the system pulled results. There were thousands of emails. Most were routine vendor correspondence project updates, meeting confirmations. I sorted by external recipients and started reading backward from the most recent. It took me 40 minutes to find the first one that mattered. It was dated 14 months ago, sent from Preston's company account to an address I did not recognize, a string of letters and numbers at a private domain that Alan would later identify as an encrypted routing service used to obscure the true recipient. The subject line read, "Quarterly Update." The body of the email was brief. "Transfer of the Riverside portfolio is 90% complete. The old man has not requested an audit of the subsidiary accounts in over a year. Recommend proceeding with the remaining Henderson Street properties before end of quarter. Confirm receipt." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. The Riverside portfolio was a collection of commercial properties I had acquired over 11 years: office buildings, a small hotel, 2 mixed-use developments along the Cumberland River. Their combined value at last appraisal was just under $40 million. I had not requested an audit of the subsidiary accounts because I had trusted the man managing them. In Tennessee, the fraudulent transfer of corporate assets through forged signatures or unauthorized authorization constitutes both civil fraud and criminal theft by deception under state law, with felony charges applicable when the amount exceeds $10,000. What Preston had been doing, if the email meant what I believed it meant, was not a bookkeeping error. It was a systematic dismantling of everything I had built, conducted over years from inside my own organization, by someone I had loved. I kept reading. 11 months ago, the notary situation is handled. Documents will be clean. 8 months ago, old man asked about the Henderson Street closing timeline. Told him it was delayed due to permitting. He accepted it. 6 months ago, 3 more signature pages needed. Can you arrange the same process as before? 3 months ago, he's been asking Margaret questions about the old business structure, monitor and report. And then 4 weeks ago, sent the night before I had driven to Millbrook for what I had believed was a routine meeting. He stopped in Millbrook today. Saw the girl. This is a problem. Advise immediately. My chest stopped working correctly for a moment. He had known. Before I had made a single phone call, before I had spoken to Alan, before I had done anything except walk into a grocery store and drop a bottle of sweet tea, Preston had known I had seen her. Someone in Millbrook had been watching. Someone had reported back within hours. I picked up my phone and called Alan. "He's been monitoring me," I said when Alan answered. "And he knew about Sarah within hours of my visit. He has someone in Millbrook." A pause. Then Alan said very quietly, "Then we need to move faster than I planned." "Yes," I said. Outside the window, the oak tree Claire had loved was catching the last of the afternoon light. I looked at it for a moment, and then looked away. Alan, I said. Whatever it takes. Alan told me to give him 72 hours before I went back to Millbrook. I gave him 48. I am not a patient man by nature, and 20 years of practicing patience had not changed that it had only taught me to disguise it better. I drove back on a Tuesday morning in early September, when the heat had started to ease and the hills around Millbrook had taken on the first faint suggestion of color at the edges. I did not check into the Pineview this time. I parked on the main strip, walked to Callaway's, and pushed through the door like a man who had every reason in the world to be there. Sarah Mills looked up from behind the counter, and her expression did something complicated. Not quite surprise, not quite the wariness from before, but something in between, that told me she had thought about my first visit more than she might have wanted to. "Mr. Harmon," she said. "Gerald," I said. "Please." She held my gaze for a moment, then reached under the counter and produced a jar of the blackberry preserves without being asked. "You forgot these last time," she said. I almost smiled. "I did," I said. "Thank you." I paid for the preserves and did not leave. I found a wooden stool near the end of the counter, the kind that existed in stores like this for regulars who came as much for conversation as for groceries, and I sat down and opened the jar and ate a spoonful of preserves directly, which made Sarah blink. "That's not typically how people eat those," she said. "I'm not typically patient enough to find a cracker," I said. That got a reaction. She had not intended to give me a short exhale through her nose. That was not quite a laugh, but was close enough that it changed the temperature in the room slightly. We talked for 20 minutes. I asked about the store, about Millbrook, about how long she had been working for Ruth. She answered carefully the way someone answers when they are deciding in real time how much to give. She had been at Callaway's for 9 years. She had come to Millbrook when she was 12, brought by a woman she had been told was arranging her care after her mother passed. She had grown up in the apartment above the hardware store 2 blocks over. She had taken online classes through the county community college when she could afford the fees. Every detail she offered landed in my chest, like something I would carry for the rest of my life. Ruth Callaway came out from the back room while we were talking. She was a wide woman in her mid-60s with white hair cut close and the kind of face that had been kind for so long it had simply become the default setting. She looked at me with the particular assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people across a counter and had gotten very good at it. "You're back," she said to me, not unfriendly, observational. "Yes, ma'am," I said. She refilled Sarah's coffee mug without being asked, and then stood with her own mug and looked at me steadily for a moment, before she said, "You mind helping me with something in the back? Shelf needs reorganizing and my knees aren't what they used to be." Sarah raised an eyebrow. Ruth's request had the transparency of a screen door, and all 3 of us knew it. But Sarah turned back to the register, and Ruth tilted her head toward the back room, and I followed her through a doorway hung with a beaded curtain into a storage area that smelled like cardboard and coffee grounds. Ruth set her mug on a shelf and crossed her arms and looked at me without any preamble whatsoever. "You're here because of Sarah," she said. "Yes," I said. "You're not law enforcement." "No." "You're not a reporter." "No." She studied me the way Margaret studied things, with a patience that did not require filling. "Then who are you to her?" I had rehearsed several versions of this answer on the drive from Nashville. Every version I had prepared dissolved when I was actually standing in front of this woman who had fed my daughter breakfast for 9 years and kept a light on in the window of this store, and loved her without knowing why she felt compelled to. "I think I'm her father," I said. Ruth did not move for a long moment. Her arms stayed crossed. Her expression did not collapse into the way I had half expected. Instead, it did something slower and more complicated, like a door opening on a room that had been locked for a very long time. "I know she's not a real orphan," Ruth said quietly. "I've known since she was about 14. She used to talk in her sleep when she first came here and stayed with me those first few months. She'd call out for her daddy." Ruth's voice dropped on the last word in a way that made my throat close. I tried once to find out more, made one phone call to the address on the envelope the woman left behind. Got a call back the same day from a man I didn't know, telling me to mind my own business if I wanted to keep my store. She pressed her lips together. I kept the envelope. My heart rate doubled. "You still have it?" Ruth uncrossed her arms and reached into the front pocket of her apron. She produced a small rectangle of paper yellowed at the edges, folded in thirds. She held it out to me. I took it with both hands. My fingers were shaking badly enough that I had trouble unfolding it. But when I finally got it open there, it was a Nashville address in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. Diane's handwriting. I stood in Ruth's back room and stared at Diane's handwriting until the letters stopped looking like letters and started looking like evidence, which is exactly what they were. The address was for a property management company on West End Avenue in Nashville, a business I knew by name because Diane had used it to handle the rental properties she had brought into our marriage. The handwriting was hers without question. I had seen it on grocery lists and birthday cards and the occasional check for 20 years. There was no ambiguity, no room for coincidence. I folded the envelope carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket. "I need to photograph this before anything else happens to it," I said. "And I need Alan Marsh to log it as part of a formal investigation record." In American civil and criminal proceedings, physical evidence must be documented with a clear chain of custody, meaning a record of who handled it, when, and under what circumstances, to be admissible in court. Ruth handing me a 20-year-old envelope in a storage room was not sufficient on its own, but it was a starting point, and starting points were what we needed. Ruth nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. "You take it," she said. "I've held on to it long enough." I thanked her and walked back through the beaded curtain into the store. Sarah was helping a customer with a question about local honey, standing with her hip against the counter, pointing at the label with 2 fingers, explaining something with a patient expertise that reminded me so sharply of Claire, at 12, explaining the word flamboyance at the breakfast counter, that I had to stop walking for a moment and collect myself against a shelf of canned peaches. I left without saying goodbye. I did not trust my voice. That evening I drove the 3 blocks to the Pine View and called Alan and photographed the envelope and emailed him the images and sat on the edge of the bed and tried to eat a sandwich from the diner next door and managed about half of it before giving up. At 9:47 that night, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. She had taken my card from the counter when I left Callaway's that morning, and I had not realized she had kept it until her name appeared on my screen. I almost ignored it. Then something made me open it. The text contained a single image, a photograph of a handwritten letter taken in poor light, slightly out of focus at the edges, like someone had photographed it quickly, maybe with a shaking hand. Sarah had sent it. I enlarged the image and read it slowly, and by the time I reached the end, my sandwich was on the floor, and I did not remember putting it there. The letter was written in Diane's handwriting, the same handwriting as the envelope, the same deliberate, slightly forward-leaning script. It was addressed to a woman named Helen, who I would later learn had been Sarah's caretaker for the first 3 years in Millbrook, before relocating to Arizona. The letter was dated 6 weeks after the accident on Route 9. It read, "Helen Sarah is to have no contact with anyone from Nashville or the surrounding counties. She is not to use the internet unsupervised. She is not to be enrolled in any school beyond the 8th grade without my explicit written approval. If she asks about her family, tell her they are gone. If she asks about her father, specifically tell her he never looked for her." She is not to have a phone until she is 18, and when she does, it is to be a prepaid with no data plan. These are not suggestions. If any of these conditions are violated, the arrangement ends, and so does your payment. Handle her quietly. She has a tendency to ask too many questions. I read it 3 times. She has a tendency to ask too many questions. My daughter. Described by the woman who had stolen her childhood as a management problem, a liability to be contained. A 12-year-old girl with a yellow backpack and a gap in her teeth, and a word she had learned that morning, flamboyance, reduced in Diane's letter to a tendency that needed suppressing. I called Sarah. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when a person has been crying and has decided to stop. You found it in the box, I said. An hour ago, she said. It was in a tin at the bottom of a bag I've had since I came here. I never opened the tin before. I thought it was I don't know what I thought it was. A pause. Her breath was uneven at the edges. She told Helen I asked too many questions. You do, I said. You get that from me. A silence that was not empty, it was full of something that neither of us had the words for yet. Gerald. It was the first time she had used my name. My chest tightened so sharply that I pressed my free hand flat against it. Why would she do this? What did I ever? Her voice broke on the last word just slightly, and then she caught it and held it, and I heard her pull in one long, careful breath. This was never about you, I said. What Diane did had nothing to do with anything you were or weren't. You were 12 years old. You were just in the way of what she wanted. Another pause. Longer. She wanted your money, Sarah said. Not a question. She wanted the money, I said. And she wanted nothing between Preston and all of it. Sarah did not respond immediately. When she spoke again, her voice had gone quiet in a different way, not fragile but contained. Deliberate. The voice of someone reorganizing something fundamental inside themselves. I want to know everything, she said. I know, I said. And I'm going to tell you. But first, I need you to do something for me. What? Don't go anywhere alone tomorrow, I said. Not until I get there. Noah Griffin did not knock so much as announce himself. 3 hard raps on the door of room 7 at the Pineview just after 7 in the morning, while I was still in yesterday's shirt, drinking bad motel coffee and reading through Alan's latest notes. I opened the door and found a man roughly my height, but 20 years younger, wearing a gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding a phone in one hand, and radiating the particular energy of someone who had been awake for a long time and had made a decision during that time that he intended to see through. Mr. Harmon, he said. My name is Noah Griffin. I work at Millbrook Auto on Route 12. I've known Sarah Mills for going on 16 years. He held up his phone so I could see the screen. And I think you need to see what's on here before you do whatever it is you're planning to do next. I stepped back from the door. Come in, I said. He came in and looked around the room with the brief, assessing glance of someone who was not interested in the decor, but wanted to confirm there was nobody else present. Then he sat in the one chair and I sat on the edge of the bed, and he pulled up a photograph on his phone and held it out to me. It showed a man standing on the sidewalk across from Callaway's grocery. The image had been taken from a distance and at an angle probably through a window, but the subject was identifiable mid-30s, dark hair, wearing a jacket that was too expensive for Millbrook's main strip. He was looking at the front of the store with an attention that was not casual. Preston. When was this taken? I asked. 3 weeks ago, Noah said. He'd been coming around for about 4 days before I got a clear shot. Parked different places, different times. But he kept ending up in the same spot looking at the same thing. He took the phone back and scrolled. Here's a second one. Clearer. The second photograph showed Preston closer still across the street, but turned slightly so that more of his face was visible. He was looking directly at the store entrance, with an expression I recognized from 20 years of watching him in boardrooms. The focused, calculating stillness of someone running numbers in his head. "Do you know who he is?" I asked. "I ran the plates on his rental car," Noah said. "Preston Harmon. I looked him up, found his name attached to your company." He met my eyes steadily. "Sarah doesn't know I did any of this. She'd tell me I was overstepping." "You weren't overstepping," I said. Noah set the phone on the arm of the chair. "I've been watching out for Sarah since we were kids," he said. "She came to Millbrook when she was 12, and she never talked about where she was from or what happened to her family, and after a while I stopped asking because it was clear it hurt her to be asked. But I always knew something wasn't right about her story." He paused. "Handwritten. Return address was Nashville." His jaw tightened. "She read it in the back room of Callaway's, and when she came out, she'd been crying. She never told me what it said. But after that, she stopped talking about finding her family. Just stopped, like a door closing." The letter at 16. Diane's forged message telling Sarah that her father had never wanted to find her. I pressed my hand flat against my knee to keep it from shaking. Did she ever mention a man who came to Millbrook before that? Someone who presented himself as friendly, came around the store, got to know her a little. Noah's expression shifted. "Yeah," he said slowly. "When she was about 15, 16. Guy came through a few times over maybe 2 months. Said he was a developer scouting property in the area. Real friendly. Bought stuff at the store, talked to Ruth, talked to Sarah." He picked up his phone again and scrolled further back. I didn't have a camera on me back then, but I remember his face. He turned the phone to show me a screenshot, a LinkedIn profile photo. That him, Preston. Younger but unmistakably Preston. "Yes," I said. Noah lowered the phone. His voice stayed level, but something behind his eyes went very still. He was talking to a 15-year-old girl about her life and her family, he said. Asking her questions about what she remembered, telling her things. "Telling her things about me," I said. Things that weren't true. Noah absorbed that. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who was recalibrating rather than withdrawing. Then he said, "Sarah trusts almost nobody. You understand that she's spent 20 years building walls that most people never get close enough to see, let alone get past. Whatever that man said to her about you, it went in deep and it stayed." He looked at me directly. "If you're who you say you are, you need to know what you're working against." "I know," I said. "Do you—" He leaned forward slightly. "Because a DNA test is a piece of paper. What's in her head is 20 years of being told her father didn't come. That's not something a lab result fixes." The words landed with the precision of something true. "I know," I said again. Quieter this time. Noah sat back. He looked at the photographs on his phone for a moment, then locked the screen and slid it into his shirt pocket. "I'll testify to what I saw," he said. "The photographs, the dates, all of it. Whatever you need. In Tennessee, photographs taken from a public location or through a window visible from a public space do not require the subject's consent and are admissible as evidence." Noah had done nothing legally questionable. What he had done was spend 3 weeks quietly documenting a threat to someone he loved without being asked and without expecting recognition. "Thank you," I said. He stood and moved toward the door. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at me. "She called out for her daddy in her sleep until she was about 14, he said. "Ruth told me once. I always figured whoever that was, he must have been worth calling for." He held my gaze for just a moment. "Don't make me wrong about that." He left before I could answer. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after the door closed, with the morning light coming through the gap in the curtain and the coffee going cold on the nightstand. And I thought about a 15-year-old girl sitting in the back room of a grocery store, reading a letter that told her the one person she had been calling for in her sleep had never bothered to look. I thought about Preston delivering that particular piece of cruelty in person 2 years before the letter arrived, softening the ground so the lie would take root properly. And I understood for the first time the full architecture of what Diane had built. I had built everything I owned on the ability to walk into a room and say difficult things clearly. Contracts worth tens of millions of dollars, negotiations that had lasted days, conversations with bankers and lawyers and city council members who did not want to hear what I had to say and had powerful reasons to push back. I had always believed that clarity delivered without apology was a form of respect. You did not soften a hard truth for someone you considered capable of handling it. You set it straight, and you let them decide what to do with it. I reminded myself of that belief on the drive to Callaway's the morning after Noah's visit. Sarah was sweeping the front steps when I pulled up. She watched me park and approach with an expression that had something new in it, not the careful wariness of our first meeting, and not the fragile containment of the phone call 2 nights before. Something more settled, like she had spent the intervening hours making a decision and had come out the other side of it. "I figured you'd be back this morning," she said. "I need to talk to you," I said. "Not here. Somewhere we can sit." She leaned the broom against the doorframe and called inside to Ruth that she was stepping out. Ruth appeared in the doorway, looked at me, looked at Sarah, and said, "Take your time, honey." The way she said it told me Ruth already knew what kind of morning this was going to be. We walked to the diner 2 doors down and took a booth in the back corner away from the window. Sarah ordered coffee and held the mug in both hands and looked at me across the table with the patient attention of someone who had decided to hear things out before reacting. I told her everything, not in pieces, not softened at the edges, not filtered through what I thought she could handle. I told her about the hospital records that did not exist. I told her about William Carver and his medical license and his house in Costa Rica. I told her about Earl Briggs and his waterfront condo in Clearwater. I told her about PH Capital Group and the Riverside portfolio and the $40 million Preston had been systematically moving out of my company for years. I told her about Noah's photographs and Preston's visits to Millbrook when she was 15. I told her about the 2 forged letters, the one sent to her at 16, telling her I had never wanted to find her, and the one sent to me telling me she had chosen to disappear. She did not interrupt once. When I finished, she set her coffee mug down on the table with a steadiness that I recognized as the kind that costs a great deal to maintain. Her eyes were bright but dry. Her jaw was set. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the reason I stopped looking for my father is because someone mailed me a lie on a piece of paper?" "Yes," I said. "And the reason you stopped looking for me is the same?" "Yes." She looked out the window at the main strip of Millbrook for a long moment. A truck rolled past. A woman walked a dog. The ordinary morning proceeding with complete indifference to the fact that the 2 of us were sitting in a diner booth, reassembling 20 years of damage. "I want a DNA test," she said. She looked back at me. "I believe you, but I want the paper." "So do I," I said. For the same reasons. A legal DNA test for paternity in the United States requires what is called a chain of custody collection, meaning both parties must provide samples at a certified testing facility with a technician present to verify identity and document the collection process. A chain of custody test produces results that are admissible in court, as opposed to an at-home test, which establishes biological relationship but carries no legal weight in a proceeding. Given what was coming, we needed the legal weight. I had already identified a private clinic in Nashville that Alan had used before for sensitive matters. I told Sarah this. She nodded. When? She asked. Today, I said. If you're willing. She looked at me for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee and finished it and set the mug back down and said, Let me tell Ruth. We drove to Nashville in my car. The two of us, 230 miles of Tennessee highway, and I was acutely aware the entire time of how strange it was to sit next to someone who might be my daughter and not know what to say to her. I asked about the online courses she had taken through the county college. She told me about a literature class she had loved and an accounting course she had taken twice because the first time the professor had gone too fast. She asked me about the company. I told her more than I had intended to. The collection took 20 minutes at the clinic. A technician photographed our identification, documented the chain of custody, collected the samples, and told us results would be available in 3 to 5 business days. 3 to 5 business days. I drove Sarah back to Millbrook that afternoon, and the return trip was quieter than the first. Not uncomfortable. Closer to the silence of two people who had said the necessary things and were now living in the space between the saying and the knowing. The next 4 days were the longest of my life. I stayed at the Pine View. I worked remotely, or tried to. I have no memory of anything I actually accomplished during those 4 days. I walked the main strip of Millbrook every evening and did not go into Callaway's because I had promised myself I would give Sarah the space to process without my presence pressing on her. Alan called twice with updates on the asset investigation. I listened and responded and retained almost nothing. On the 4th evening, I was sitting on the steps of the motel, watching the last of the light go off the hills when my phone rang. Alan. I answered before the second ring finished. The results came in an hour early, he said. His voice had something in it I had not heard before, something careful and full at the same time. Gerald. Are you sitting down? My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. Tell me, I said. 99.97%, Alan said. I did not respond right away. The words reached, but they took a moment to travel the full distance from the phone pressed against my ear to whatever part of me had been holding its breath for 4 days, for 4 weeks, for 20 years. Gerald, Alan said carefully. You still with me? I'm here, I said. My voice came out in a register I barely recognized, rough at the edges, stripped of everything I normally kept around it. I'm here. I sat on those motel steps for another 10 minutes after the call ended. The hills had gone dark. The lights along Millbrook's main strip flickered on one by one. A family walked past on the sidewalk, 2 parents, a little girl between them, holding both their hands, swinging forward on the count of 3, laughing at nothing in particular, the way children laugh when they feel completely safe. I watched them until they turned the corner. Then I stood up, went inside, washed my face, put on a clean shirt, and walked to Callaway's. Ruth had closed the store 20 minutes earlier, but the lights were still on inside. I knocked, and she appeared at the glass door and looked at my face and opened it without a word. She had been crying recently. Her eyes were pink at the rims, which told me Alan had likely called Sarah before he called me, or Sarah had called Ruth the moment she heard. She's in the back, Ruth said. Her voice was thick, She put one hand briefly on my arm as I passed. Just that. Just her hand on my arm for 2 seconds, warm and certain, and then she let me go. Sarah was sitting at the small table in the back room, where Ruth kept the accounting books, and the coffee maker, and a single folding chair that she had supplemented with a cushion so old its original color was a matter of speculation. Sarah had pulled a second chair from somewhere, and she was sitting with her elbows on the table, and a printed document in front of her, the results which Alan must have sent to her directly. She looked up when I came in. Her eyes were red. Her face was not composed in the way it had been in the diner. The careful steadiness she had maintained through that entire conversation was gone, and what was underneath it was rawer and younger and somehow more familiar to me than anything I had seen in 20 years. I sat down across from her. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The coffee maker on the counter behind her was doing something that involved a great deal of gurgling. And outside on the main strip, a car alarm went off briefly, and then stopped. And the ordinary world continued to go about its ordinary business. Then Sarah pushed the document across the table toward me with 2 fingers, like she needed me to hold it. I picked it up. The probability figure was printed in a standard font in the middle of the 3rd page, preceded by 2 pages of technical language about allele markers and locus comparisons. 99.97%. The report noted that a result above 99.9% was considered a conclusive confirmation of biological relationship under the evidentiary standards applied by Tennessee family courts. I set the document down. "I have something for you," I said. I reached into my jacket and removed 2 envelopes photocopies Alan had made of the forged letters with the originals already logged as evidence. I had carried them for 3 days, waiting for this moment. I placed them on the table between us. "The one on the left was sent to you when you were 16, I said. "It told you I had never wanted to find you. It was written to look like it came from my attorney's office. It did not." I touched the second envelope. "This one was delivered to me 2 weeks later. It said you had contacted Diane directly, that you wanted nothing to do with me, and that you had asked not to be searched for." I looked at her. I believed it. I am sorry that I believed it. Sarah stared at the envelopes without touching them. Her jaw worked. She pressed her lips together hard enough to drain the color from them. "I was 16, she said. "I know. I read that letter and I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought you had moved on. I thought you had a whole life, and I was just something inconvenient from before it." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pulled in a sharp breath through her nose and held it. "I stopped saying your name after that. I wouldn't let myself say it anymore because it hurt too much to want something I thought didn't want me back." My throat closed completely. I could not have spoken if I had tried. Sarah looked up at me. Her eyes were wet, and she let them be wet, which told me she had stopped performing composure and was simply present in this room with what was true. "Did you know about me?" she asked. "Before all of this? Did you ever, was there any part of you that knew?" "Yes," I said. The word came out barely above a whisper. I didn't let myself believe it. But yes. Some part of me always knew I had buried an empty box. Sarah made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, but contained elements of both. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Her shoulders shook once hard, and then she pulled in a long breath and straightened. "I have spent 20 years, she said carefully, "being angry at a person I thought had forgotten me." "I know. And you spent 20 years missing you," I said. "Every single day." She looked at me across the narrow table in the back room of a small-town grocery store in Millbrook, Tennessee. with the coffee maker gurgling behind her and the forged letters between us and 20 years of deliberate cruelty surrounding us on all sides. Then she said, "Dad." Just that. One word. The word I had not heard in 20 years, spoken in the voice of someone who had not said it in just as long, and it went through me like something I had no defense against and had never wanted one. I reached across the table and took her hand in both of mine and held on. I thought the hardest part was behind us. That is the thing about relief. It makes you careless. For 3 days after the night in Ruth's back room, I let myself believe that the worst of what Diane and Preston could do had already been done. Sarah and I had talked every evening. Long calls, sometimes 2 hours, covering 20 years of ground, in no particular order: her childhood in Millbrook, my company in its early years, the things we had both missed. She had a dry humor I had not expected, and a way of asking questions that reminded me of myself at 30, when I had still believed that the right question asked clearly enough could solve most problems. I was sitting in the Pine View on a Wednesday evening eating takeout from the diner and reading a contract Alan had flagged for review when my phone buzzed with a call from Sarah. I answered on the first ring. "Hey." Her voice hit me like cold water. "I need you to explain something to me." The tone stopped me completely. Not the Sarah from the last 3 days, not the careful warmth that had been building between us like something tentative and new. This was the voice from our very first conversation at the counter of Callaway's. Flat, controlled, built to reveal nothing. "What's wrong?" I asked. "I got a voice message tonight," she said, "from a number I didn't recognize. It's your voice, Gerald, and I need you to tell me right now that it isn't real." My takeout container went onto the nightstand. I was already standing. "Send it to me." The files arrived 30 seconds later. I pressed play. My own voice came through the speaker, recognizable, unmistakably mine, the cadence and register I had heard on recorded calls for 30 years. The words were arranged into a sequence that made my stomach drop. The recording said in my voice that Sarah was a complication, that the DNA test had been a mistake, that I had consulted with my attorneys and determined that acknowledging her publicly would create significant liability for harm and development, that the wisest course was to provide her a settlement and walk away cleanly. I listened to it twice. Then I called Alan. "Preston," I said the moment he picked up. "He's recorded me somewhere and cut it together. I need a forensic audio analyst, tonight if possible." Alan did not waste time asking questions. "I have someone in Nashville. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. I called Sarah back immediately. She picked up on the first ring but said nothing, just waited, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. "Sarah," I said, "listen to me carefully. That recording is assembled from pieces of real conversations. The words are mine, but the meaning is not. I have never said those things in that sequence, and I have never meant them. How do I know that—" Her voice was tight, controlled in the way that things are controlled when they are very close to breaking. "How do I know you're not saying exactly what someone would say if the recording were real?" The question was fair. It was the exact question I would have asked. "You don't," I said. "Not yet. Give me until tomorrow morning. If I can't prove it to you by then, you have every right to walk away and I will not follow." A long pause. Long enough that I pressed the phone harder against my ear just to confirm the call was still connected. "Tomorrow morning," she said, and ended the call. I did not sleep. Alan's contact, a forensic audio analyst named Dr. Patricia Reeves, who worked primarily with law firms and insurance companies in Nashville, agreed to take the file on an emergency basis. By 11 that night, she had confirmed what I already knew. The recording contained 17 separate edits detectable through spectrographic analysis, which examines the visual representation of sound frequencies to identify unnatural breaks and inconsistencies in background noise and vocal resonance. The words had been extracted from at least 4 different source recordings and reassembled into a false sequence. The question was where Preston had obtained the source material. Noah answered that question at 7 the following morning. He had been suspicious of Preston since the photographs 3 weeks earlier and had taken it upon himself to do something that was straightforward and effective and entirely characteristic of him. He had gone through the lost and found box at Millbrook Auto, where Preston's rental car had been brought in for a minor repair during his most recent visit, and had found a small recording device, the kind designed to look like a loose coin battery, that had slipped into the gap between the seat rail and the door panel, invisible, unless you were specifically looking for it. The mechanic who detailed the car after the repair had found it wedged there and turned it in without knowing what it was. The device contained 11 hours of audio. Gerald's voice appeared in 4 separate segments, phone calls Preston had recorded by planting the device in the rental car during a period when I had borrowed it briefly to move some boxes from the Pineview to Margaret's storage unit. Noah brought the device to me at the motel at 7:15. I called Alan. Alan called Dr. Reeves. By 9:45 that morning, Dr. Reeves had matched the source segments on the device to the edited recording Preston had sent Sarah with a confidence level she described as absolute. I drove to Callaway's at 10. Sarah was behind the counter when I came in. She looked at me with an expression that was exhausted and wary, and underneath both of those things, desperately hoping. I placed Dr. Reeves's written preliminary report on the counter. I placed a printed transcript of the source recordings beside it. I placed the spectrographic analysis alongside that. 17 edits, I said. I can walk you through every one of them. Sarah looked at the documents for a long moment. Then she looked up at me, and her eyes filled, and she pressed both hands flat on the counter and leaned forward and said, "He used your voice against me." "Yes," I said. "He did." Her jaw tightened. Her eyes dried as fast as they had filled. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something harder and quieter, and considerably more dangerous than anything I had heard from her before. "I want to make sure," she said, "that he never gets the chance to do it again." Alan called on a Thursday morning in early November, with the voice of a man who had found something he wished he had not. I had come to recognize Alan's different registers over the past weeks. There was his working voice, brisk, informational, moving from point to point, with the efficiency of someone who billed by the hour and respected his own time. There was his careful voice, slower, more deliberate, used when he was about to deliver something that required the other person to be sitting down. And there was a third register I had only heard twice before in all the years I had known him. Quiet in a way that was not calm. The voice of someone who had looked at something ugly for long enough that the ugliness had gotten into him a little. That was the voice he used on Thursday morning. "I need you to come to my office," he said. "Today. Bring Margaret if she's available." I called Margaret before I had finished pulling on my jacket. She arrived at Alan's office on Music Row in Nashville 40 minutes after I did, still wearing the cardigan she had been grading papers in when I called, with a travel mug of coffee she had not had time to finish. She took one look at Alan's expression when we walked in and sat down without being asked. Alan placed a manila folder on the desk between us. "I've been working the financial trail on the asset transfers," he said. "In the course of that work, I subpoenaed records from 3 medical practices in the Nashville area that have historical billing relationships with Diane's personal accounts." He opened the folder. This came back from a practice in Brentwood. I looked at the document inside. It was a psychiatric evaluation. My name was at the top. The evaluating physician was listed as a Dr. Harold Sims of the Brentwood Behavioral Health Group. The document was dated 14 months ago, 2 months before the first email I had found in Preston's archive, the one discussing the Riverside portfolio transfer being 90% complete. The evaluation described a patient presenting with symptoms of late-onset delusional disorder, characterized by persistent false beliefs regarding the death of a family member, difficulty distinguishing memory from imagination, and episodes of what the document called grief-induced cognitive disruption. The recommendation section suggested the patient lacked the capacity to make sound financial and legal decisions without supervised oversight. The patient was me. I had never met Harold Sims. I had never been to the Brentwood Behavioral Health Group. I had never consented to a psychiatric evaluation of any kind. Margaret picked up the document and read it in full. When she set it down, her hands were not entirely steady. "They were going to use this to have you declared incompetent," she said. "Sure, that was the plan," Alan said. He settled back in his chair. In Tennessee, the legal process for establishing that an adult lacks the capacity to manage their own affairs is called a conservatorship proceeding. It requires a petition filed in probate court supported by medical evidence, typically 2 independent psychiatric evaluations. The petitioner in this case, most likely Diane or Preston acting through an attorney, was preparing to file an emergency petition in probate court, using this fraudulent evaluation as leverage to freeze your voting rights in Harmon Development and force a legal conservatorship. "They only had one evaluation," I said. "So far as I can find," Alan said. "My belief is that this document was the first step. If Gerald had begun actively searching for Sarah or attempted to change his will, they would have commissioned a second evaluation from another cooperative physician and filed the petition immediately." He looked at me steadily. The goal was not necessarily to win a conservatorship. The goal was to create enough legal noise and delay that any changes Gerald made to his estate could be challenged as the actions of a man whose competence was already under formal question. The room was quiet for a moment, except for the sound of traffic on Music Row, and Margaret pressing her lips together hard enough that I could hear it. "Harold Sims," Margaret said. "Is he still practicing?" "His license is active," Alan said. "I have referred the document to the Tennessee Board of Psychiatry for investigation. A physician who produces a false evaluation of a patient they have never examined is subject to license revocation and potential criminal charges under Tennessee Code. Annotated Section 39-016-702, which covers the filing of false reports in professional contexts." He paused. "I also have a forensic document examiner reviewing the signatures. My expectation is that Sims signed a document prepared by someone else, possibly without reading it carefully, in exchange for payment." I sat with that for a moment. 20 years ago, Diane had paid a doctor to sign a death certificate for a child who was not dead. 14 months ago, she had paid a different doctor to sign a psychiatric evaluation for a man who had never been evaluated. The instrument was the same, the signature of a medical professional attached to a lie, converting a fiction into something that looked like fact on paper. She had been doing this for 2 decades. She was very good at it. "What do I do with this?" I asked. "Nothing yet," Alan said. "We document it, we add it to the evidentiary record, and we use it at the right moment." He leaned forward. "Gerald, I want to brief a federal agent I know at the FBI field office in Nashville. What Diane and Preston have done crosses into federal wire fraud and mail fraud territory because they used electronic communications and the Postal Service to execute their scheme. Federal charges carry significantly heavier consequences than state charges, and they remove any possibility of a sympathetic local judge. Margaret set her coffee mug down on the edge of Alan's desk. "How soon?" she asked. "I can make the call this afternoon," Alan said. I looked at the psychiatric evaluation with my name on the top and thought about the 14 months it had been sitting in a filing cabinet in Brentwood, waiting to be deployed against me the moment I stepped out of line. I thought about Diane preparing it with the same methodical patience she had applied to everything else: the forged death certificate, the paid witnesses, the letters designed to keep a father and daughter convinced they had been abandoned by each other. She had built a machine designed to run for decades. She had built redundancies into it. She had thought of nearly everything. Margaret put her hand over mine on the armrest of the chair. "Nearly everything," I said aloud without meaning to. Alan looked at me. "What?" "She thought of nearly everything," I said. She didn't think of Ruth keeping an envelope for 20 years. She didn't think of a 12-year-old girl writing in a notebook before she went to sleep. I looked at the folder. She didn't think of Noah Griffin. Alan almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but I caught it. "No," he said. She did not think of Noah Griffin. I have sat across from a great many people in my life who held power over outcomes I cared about. Bankers who could approve or deny financing that would make or break a development project. City council members whose single vote determined whether a building got built or stayed a set of blueprints. Attorneys who had spent 30 years learning to make the truth sound however they needed it to sound. I had learned early that the key to those rooms was not to walk in wanting something visibly. You walked in knowing something. The wanting came later, after the knowing had done its work. I applied that principle to the meeting at Margaret's house on a Saturday evening in mid-November. Sarah drove up from Millbrook in her own car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked side mirror that she had told me she kept meaning to fix. She arrived 20 minutes early, which told me she was nervous, and walked through Margaret's front door with the careful composure of someone entering a room they had decided in advance not to be intimidated by. Margaret met her in the hallway, and the two women looked at each other for a long moment, the aunt who had kept 20 years of a child's belongings in a wooden chest, and the child who had grown up not knowing anyone was keeping them. Margaret opened her arms. Sarah walked into them without hesitation. I had to look away. Alan arrived next, with a woman I had not met before. Special Agent Dana Whitfield of the FBI's Nashville field office was somewhere in her mid-40s, with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried precision of someone who had spent 2 decades building cases that needed to hold up under the most aggressive defense attorneys money could buy. She carried a leather portfolio and shook hands with each of us in turn, and accepted Margaret's offer of coffee with a brevity that suggested she drank a great deal of it and had stopped registering the ritual. We sat around Margaret's dining room table. Agent Whitfield opened her portfolio and placed a printed summary of Alan's investigative findings in front of her. She had already reviewed everything Alan had sent: the PH Capital Group Incorporation records, the forensic audio analysis, the false psychiatric evaluation, the chain of custody documentation on the envelope, and the forged letters. "What you have assembled here," she said, looking at Alan and then at me, "constitutes a strong predicate for federal charges under Title 18 of the United States Code. Specifically wire fraud under Section 1343, mail fraud under Section 1341, and conspiracy to commit both under Section 1349. Each count of wire fraud carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. Each count of mail fraud carries the same." She set her pen on the table. "I want to be direct with you. Based on what I have reviewed, we have enough to move on Preston Harmon today. Diane Harmon is more complex because her direct participation is evidenced primarily through documents rather than recorded communications. You need her to act," Alan said. "I need her to act," Agent Whitfield confirmed. She looked at me. Mr. Harmon Allen has briefed me on the idea of making your estate changes public. I want to discuss what that looks like in practice. I had thought about it for 2 weeks. I filed the amended will through my attorney of record, I said. I make no effort to conceal it. I inform Preston directly in a recorded conversation that I am acknowledging Sarah as my daughter and the sole primary heir. Preston tells Diane. Diane moves. Agent Whitfield nodded slowly. In our experience with financial fraud cases of this complexity, a subject who has spent years building a careful scheme does not respond to a direct threat to that scheme with patience. They respond with urgency. Diane Harmon has demonstrated throughout this case a willingness to take significant action when she believes her position is at risk. She paused. We will have surveillance in place. We will monitor all known communication channels for both subjects, and we will have personnel positioned in Millbrook, since that is where Sarah is and where Diane is most likely to direct her attention. Sarah had been listening without speaking. She had her hands folded on the table, and her posture was straight, and her face was composed in the way I had come to recognize as her version of focus rather than distance. She'll come after me, Sarah said, not a question. We believe she will attempt to take action that protects her position, Agent Whitfield said carefully. Our job is to ensure that action occurs in a controlled environment where we can respond immediately. Sarah looked at me. And your job? To make sure you are never in that environment alone, I said. Agent Whitfield outlined the operational parameters. Gerald would file the amended will Monday morning. His attorney would send Preston a formal notification letter that same afternoon. Gerald would follow up with a personal call to Preston recorded with Agent Whitfield present, confirming the changes and their implications for the estate structure. After that, we waited for Diane to move. Margaret refilled everyone's coffee without being asked, and sat back down and looked at Agent Whitfield with the direct gaze she had once used on 8th graders who thought they could get away with things. How long do we expect to wait? Margaret asked. Based on the pattern of behavior we've observed, Agent Whitfield said, I would estimate days rather than weeks, possibly less. The meeting ended just before 10. Sarah and I walked out to the driveway together while Alan and Agent Whitfield finished their conversation inside. The November air had gone cold enough to see our breath. Sarah stood with her arms crossed against the chill and looked up at the oak tree at the edge of Margaret's yard. Are you scared? I asked. She considered the question seriously the way she considered everything. Yes, she said. But I've been scared my whole life of things that weren't my fault. She looked at me. This one I get to fight back. I wanted to tell her something that captured what that sentence did to me. I did not have the words for it. Tomorrow morning. I said instead, don't go anywhere alone. She gave me the look she had developed over recent weeks. For moments when I repeated instructions she had already committed to memory. I know, Dad, she said. She got in her Civic and drove back toward Millbrook. I stood in the driveway until her taillights disappeared around the corner, and then stood there a while longer in the cold, with the oak tree moving slowly overhead and the lights of Margaret's house warm behind me. I had built things my whole life. Companies, structures, frameworks designed to last. I understood standing in that driveway that everything I had ever built had been preparation for building this, whatever came next, with my daughter from whatever ground we had left after 20 years of damage. I was ready. Before I reveal the explosive truth and the ultimate confrontation, drop a comment with "still here" or the number 100 below, so I know you're still following along. And please note the upcoming events include some fictional elements added for dramatic effect. If that's not your cup of tea, feel free to stop the video right here. Diane did not wait long. I had expected days. Agent Whitfield had estimated days. What we got was 41 hours. I filed the amended will Monday morning through my attorney of record. The document named Sarah Claire Harmon as primary heir to the Harmon estate established a trust structure for the transition of controlling interest in Harmon development, and formally acknowledged Sarah's biological relationship to me through the results of the court-admissible DNA test conducted in October. By 2 that afternoon, the notification letter had been delivered to Preston's office by certified mail, a delivery method that created a legal record of receipt that he could not later dispute. Under federal rules of civil procedure, certified mail delivery constitutes valid legal notice the moment the recipient signs for it. Preston had signed for it at 2:14. I made the call to Preston at 4:15. He picked up on the third ring. His voice was smooth and unhurried in the way of someone who had been expecting the call and had prepared for it. That preparation told me Agent Whitfield had been right. 41 hours had been more than enough time for Diane to brief him on how to respond. "Gerald," he said, "I got the letter." "I know," I said. "I wanted to hear your voice when you did." A pause. Just half a second, barely perceptible. But I had known Preston Harmon for 20 years, and I had listened to that pause in that register exactly once before the morning. I had called him to say I was auditing the Riverside subsidiary accounts and needed the records on his desk by end of day. He had covered it then, too. But I had caught it. "She's not who she says she is," Preston said. His voice had settled into something careful and reasonable. The voice of a man who had spent years practicing sincerity the way other people practiced scales. "I understand that this woman has made a compelling case, but a DNA test can be manipulated by Preston." I kept my voice even. "I know about PH Capital Group." The line went very quiet. Agent Whitfield, sitting across from me at the conference table in Alan's office, made a small note in her portfolio without looking up. She had told me before the call that the moment I named PH Capital Group, I would hear either anger or silence. Anger meant he still thought he could fight it. Silence meant he was calculating his exit. What I heard was silence. "I know about the Riverside transfers," I continued. "I know about William Carver and Earl Briggs. I know about Harold Sims and the evaluation he signed without meeting me. I know about the recording device in the rental car." A pause of my own deliberate. "I know about the letters." Preston said nothing. The silence on the line was a different quality now. Not the controlled pause of a prepared man, but the stillness of someone who had just watched the board clear and realized he had no pieces left. "Whatever happens next," I said, "I want you to know that I am giving you this call as a courtesy. Because I did love you. Whatever you are, I loved the boy I thought you were. And I thought you deserved to hear my voice before the rest of it begins." I ended the call. Agent Whitfield looked up from her portfolio. "That was either very effective or very risky," she said. "Both," Alan said from the corner of the room. I set the phone on the conference table and looked at it for a moment. 20 years of believing Preston was the one good thing that had come out of marrying Diane, and he had been watching me the entire time the way a man watches a door he intends to walk through the moment it opens wide enough. I did not feel grief about that anymore. I had used up all the grief I had for Preston Harmon somewhere around the third email in his archive, the one where he had described my questions about the Henderson Street closing timeline as manageable. I had been a variable to be managed. That was all I had ever been to him. I picked up the phone and slid it into my jacket pocket. "What now?" I asked Agent Whitfield. "Now we wait," she said. "And we watch." Diane moved within 6 hours of that call. Alan's contact in the county records office flagged an inquiry on Sarah's rental history in Millbrook at 11 that evening. Someone running her address through a tenant database using a search account registered to a property management company that Alan's team had already identified as a shell entity connected to Diane's financial network. The inquiry had been routed through 2 proxy servers before hitting the database, which was sophisticated enough to suggest professional assistance. It was not sophisticated enough to avoid Alan's contact, who had been watching that particular shell account for 3 weeks. By midnight, Noah had texted me a photograph of an unfamiliar dark sedan parked 2 blocks from Callaway's with its engine running and its lights off. I called Agent Whitfield at 12:15. "We see it," she said before I could speak. "We have been on it since 10. Do not go to Millbrook tonight. Our people are already there." "How many?" I asked. "Enough," she said. Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had been in enough of these situations to know that specifics made civilians more anxious rather than less. "Gerald, stay where you are. The moment you drive into Millbrook tonight, you change the variables. Let us do our job." I agreed. I ended the call and stood in the middle of Alan's guest room and did not sit down, because I knew that if I sat down, I would stand back up in 45 seconds, and that getting up and sitting down repeatedly was not the same thing as patience, even if it occupied similar amounts of time. I paced instead. At 2 in the morning, my phone rang. "Sarah?" "There's a car outside," she said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it cost her, the careful, deliberate steadiness of someone who had decided how they were going to sound before they dialed. "It's been there for 40 minutes. Noah is parked at the end of my street. He called me before I saw it." "I know about the car," I said. "Agent Whitfield has people watching it. Do not go outside. Lock every window and stay away from the front rooms." "I'm not going outside," she said. "I'm not stupid." "I know you're not," I said, a beat of quiet. "Sarah." "I know, Dad," she said. "I'm okay. I'm angry, but I'm okay." She had said that to me before in different circumstances, and I had learned by now that when Sarah described herself as angry, it meant she had located the feeling precisely enough to name it, which meant she had it under control. It was the things she did not name that worried me. She had not named fear. I chose to take that at face value. "Try to sleep," I said. "You too," she said. The way she said it, dry, affectionate, fully aware that neither of us would manage it, was so precisely the tone Margaret used when she said things she knew were impossible that my throat tightened for a second, in a way I was not prepared for. I held the phone against my ear long after she hung up, and listened to the silence of Alan's guest room and thought about a 12-year-old girl who had written in a notebook that something felt wrong and had not been wrong and had not been protected. I thought about 20 years of distance that I could not cross, and 20 minutes of highway that I was being asked not to drive, and the difference between those 2 things felt at 2 in the morning like almost nothing at all. I had been the wrong kind of patient for 20 years. I had been patient in the direction of grief rather than in the direction of answers. And the result of that patience was a daughter who had grown up calling for me in her sleep until she stopped believing it was worth calling. At 4:17, Alan knocked on the guest room door. "She's moving," he said through the door. "Agent Whitfield just called. Diane left her hotel 20 minutes ago. They're tracking her." I was on my feet before he finished the sentence. "Millbrook?" I asked. "Millbrook," he said. I grabbed my keys from the nightstand, my jacket from the chair. I was through the door and down the hallway before Alan could say another word. and I heard him behind me saying something about waiting, about the protocol, about Agent Whitfield's instructions, and I heard every word of it, and I did not slow down. Outside, the December air hit my face like cold water, and the highway stretched out ahead of me dark and empty, and I drove south toward Millbrook with both hands on the wheel and one thought in my head. Not this time. I was not going to be 41 hours too late and one phone call short and standing at a graveside wondering what I should have done differently. Not this time. The drive from Nashville to Millbrook takes 2 hours and 17 minutes under normal conditions. I made it in an hour and 54. The December sky was still fully dark when I crossed into Millbrook's county line, the kind of dark that exists in the hour before dawn, when even the birds have not decided to start yet. I had Agent Whitfield on speaker the entire drive. She told me twice to slow down. I told her I would try. I did not try very hard. Our team has eyes on Diane's vehicle, she said at one point. She parked 3 blocks from Calloway's 12 minutes ago. She has not moved. Gerald, our people are positioned. You need to let them work. Where is Sarah? I asked. A pause. We believe she is still in her apartment above the hardware store. You believe. Another pause. Gerald. Where is Sarah? I asked again. Agent Whitfield's voice dropped a register. Noah reported 2 minutes ago that her apartment light came on. She may have heard something. I pressed the accelerator down and stopped talking. I came into Millbrook on the South Road and killed my headlights 2 blocks out in the way. Alan had once told me to do if I ever needed to approach somewhere without announcing myself. The main strip was dark and still. A single streetlight threw a yellow circle on the wet pavement in front of Calloway's. The dark sedan Noah had photographed was gone from its spot 2 blocks north, which meant Diane had moved it, which meant something had changed in the last 12 minutes. I parked and got out of the car, and that was when I saw Sarah. She was at the far end of the alley that ran behind Calloway's, standing under the single light mounted above Ruth's back door. She was wearing a coat over what looked like pajamas, and she was holding her phone in one hand with the screen lit. Noah had called her not to warn her to stay inside, but because his own phone had died mid-sentence and the call had cut out, and Sarah, hearing nothing but silence where his voice had been, had come outside to find him. She had not broken her promise. She had been trying to keep someone else safe. That was exactly who she was, and I understood it the moment I saw her face. I started toward her. I saw the movement from my left before I had covered half the distance. A figure coming fast from the shadow between 2 buildings, not running, but moving with a focused, deliberate speed that covered ground quickly without looking like urgency from a distance. I had 1 second to process what I was seeing, and I used it not to stop or to call out, but to close the remaining distance between myself and my daughter as fast as my legs would carry me. I reached Sarah and turned and put myself between her and the figure and spread my arms, and that was where I stayed. Diane Harmon stopped walking. She was 8 feet away in the yellow wash of Ruth's backlight, and she looked exactly as she had always looked, composed, precise. The kind of well-maintained that takes daily effort and reads as effortless. 20 years had added lines around her eyes and silver at her temples, and absolutely nothing to her expression, which was the same controlled arrangement of features I had watched stand beside me at my daughter's funeral and produce tears on schedule. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked past me at Sarah. You should have stayed in Millbrook, she said. Her voice was the same too. Even. Conversational. The voice she used when she wanted something and had decided that the most efficient path to it was to sound like the most reasonable person in the room. You had a life here. It wasn't much, but it was stable. You could have kept it. Sarah's hand found my arm from behind. Her grip was fierce and certain, and I felt it through my jacket like something anchoring me to the ground. "It wasn't my life," Sarah said. "You took my life." Diane's eyes moved back to me. "Gerald, step aside." "No," I said. "You are making a decision that cannot be undone." "I made it 20 years ago," I said. "The morning I let you put my daughter in a car and drive away. I made it the afternoon I signed a piece of paper with a dead man's name on it. I have been making the wrong decision for 20 years, Diane, and I am done." Something crossed her face. Not remorse. I do not believe remorse was a thing Diane was capable of, not in any form I would have recognized. But something. A recalculation. A reassessment of what she was looking at and whether it was still the thing she had built her plans around. It was not. Agent Whitfield's team came from 3 directions, simultaneously: the mouth of the alley, the far end, and the roof access door of the building to our left, which opened with a sound that made Diane's head turn sharply. 4 agents in dark jackets moved quickly and professionally and had Diane in custody before she had completed the turn with a speed and efficiency that left no room for drama or resistance or anything else. Agent Whitfield appeared at the alley entrance. She looked at me and then at Sarah, and then said into her radio, "We have the primary. What is Preston's status?" A brief response I could not hear. She nodded. "Confirmed. Take him." Preston was arrested at his Nashville apartment at 5:47 that morning, while Diane was being processed at the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. I turned around. Sarah was still behind me, her hand still on my arm, her eyes moving from the place where Diane had been standing to my face. Her grip had not loosened. In the yellow light above Ruth's back door, with the December dark pressing in around the edges, and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, she looked at me with an expression that I will carry for the rest of my life. Not relief, not triumph. Something older and quieter and far more profound than either. She stepped forward and put her arms around me and pressed her face against my shoulder, and I held my daughter in an alley in Millbrook, Tennessee in the dark before dawn, and felt 20 years of distance collapse into nothing. I did not say anything. I did not need to. Some things do not require words. Some things are complete exactly as they are, in exactly the moment they happen, without any addition from language or explanation, or the need to make them mean more than they already mean. This was one of those things. People ask me sometimes what it felt like when it was finally over. I never know quite where to start with that question. Over is a complicated word when you are talking about something that took 20 years to build and the better part of another year to dismantle properly. The morning in the alley was not the end. It was the beginning of the end, which is a different thing, entirely slower, less dramatic, more paperwork than most people imagine when they picture justice arriving. Diane and Preston were processed through the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department that morning and transferred to federal custody by noon. Under the federal criminal system in the United States, once the FBI takes jurisdiction over a case, the defendants are held pending a bail hearing before a federal magistrate judge. Agent Whitfield had built the case carefully enough that both bail applications were denied on the grounds that the defendants represented a flight risk, Diane in particular, given the documented history of using financial resources to relocate individuals across state lines. They were remanded to custody and remained there through the pretrial period. The federal grand jury indictment came down 6 weeks later in late January of 2025. The charges against Diane included wire fraud, mail fraud conspiracy, and at Allen's strong recommendation backed by the forensic reconstruction of the events of March 2005, a federal kidnapping charge under 18 U.S.C. Section 1201 related to the transportation of a minor across state lines under false pretenses, a charge that carried the possibility of life imprisonment. The charge against Preston, included all the financial fraud counts, plus accessory charges, connected to his mother's original scheme, given the evidence that he had known about Sarah's existence from at least the age of 18 and had actively participated in maintaining the deception. I sat in the federal courthouse in Nashville for every day of the trial. Sarah sat beside me. We did not discuss this arrangement in advance. The first morning of the trial, she simply appeared in the corridor outside the courtroom at 8:15, wearing a dark blazer I had not seen before, and her hair pulled back, and she took the seat next to mine without a word, and opened the notebook she had brought, and uncapped her pen. She took notes throughout the proceedings with the focused precision of someone who had decided that understanding exactly what had been done to her was the first step toward not being defined by it. I watched her more than I watched the proceedings. The trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 20 minutes, a duration that the attorneys on both sides noted was unusually brief for a case of this complexity, but that Alan said simply meant the evidence had been unusually clear. Diane was convicted on all counts. Preston was convicted on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for late spring, and in June of 2025, Diane received a federal sentence of 14 years. Preston received 9 years with the possibility of early release contingent on full cooperation with the asset recovery process. Under the terms negotiated by Allen and the federal prosecutors, Preston was required to provide a complete accounting of all fraudulent transfers from Harmon Development, including the identification of every shell company and intermediary account used in the scheme. The asset recovery took the better part of 5 months. The Riverside portfolio came back first. The fraudulent transfer documents were voided by the court, and the properties reverted to Harmon Development's balance sheet. The Henderson Street properties followed. Several overseas accounts required coordination with financial regulators in 2 additional jurisdictions, which Allen handled with a thoroughness that I suspected had something to do with the 20 years he had spent waiting to finish what he had started in 2005. When it was done, approximately $38 million in assets had been restored to the company. The $2 million that had been paid to William Carver, Earl Briggs, Harold Sims, and various other participants in the scheme over the years was designated as unrecoverable but documented fully for the court record. I gave Allen a bonus that made him uncomfortable. He argued about it for 20 minutes and then accepted it with the graceless precision of a man who had spent his whole life being better at his job than he was at receiving acknowledgement for it. Through all of it, Sarah was in Nashville. She had moved in early February, not into my house, which she had politely but firmly declined, citing a preference for her own space that I had respected immediately and completely. She had found a 1-bedroom apartment in East Nashville, a neighborhood with enough character and enough coffee shops within walking distance that she had told me slightly defensively that it suited her. I had helped her move 3 boxes and a second-hand couch, and had not offered opinions about the apartment's size or the neighborhood's parking situation, which I considered one of my finer exercises in self-restraint. Ruth had driven up from Millbrook the first weekend in February to help Sarah settle in. She had arrived with a casserole and a set of curtains she had sewn herself, and an opinion about the bathroom tiles that she delivered without being asked. I had liked her enormously from the moment she opened her door to me in Millbrook, and watching her in Sarah's apartment moving through the small space with the proprietorial ease of someone who had been caring for this particular person for 20 years and saw no reason to stop confirmed everything I had already felt about her. Noah came up on a Sunday in March. He and Sarah walked through Centennial Park for 2 hours and came back to the apartment for dinner, and I was not there for any of it, because Sarah had not invited me, and I had not expected her to. She told me about it the next day on the phone, describing the walk and the dinner with a warmth in her voice that told me everything I needed to know about what Noah Griffin was to her and what he would likely continue to be. Margaret and Sarah had lunch every other week, at a diner on 8th Avenue that Margaret had been going to since 1987 and that Sarah had declared after her first visit to have the best pie in Nashville. Margaret had texted me after that first lunch with nothing but a single sentence. "She has your stubbornness and Evelyn's taste in pie." I had laughed for the first time in longer than I could remember. On a Saturday evening in September of 2025, I hosted a dinner at my house. It was not a large event. I had learned over the past 9 months that the most important things in my life had been accomplished in small rooms by people who showed up without being asked. I set the table for 6, Sarah, Margaret, Ruth, Noah, Allen, and myself. And I cooked badly a meal that Betty had given me the recipe for 3 times over the years, without it ever quite taking. The results were uneven but earnest, which Sarah told me was the best kind of cooking. She arrived last. She came through the front door of my house for the first time. She had been to the office twice, but never to the house. And I had not pushed, carrying a white bakery box tied with kitchen twine. She set it on the counter in the kitchen, while the others were finding their seats in the dining room, and she untied the twine, and she opened the box, and inside was a pie. Berry pie. Dark filling, buttery crust, the faint smell of cinnamon reaching me from across the kitchen. She had written on the top crust, in pale pastry letters, slightly uneven, because lettering in pastry was apparently harder than it looked, a sentence that I read twice before I trusted myself to have read it correctly. "For the 20 years you never stopped being my dad." I looked at the pie for a long time. Long enough that Sarah, standing on the other side of the counter, crossed her arms and tilted her head, and said with the dry patience she had inherited from somewhere I chose not to examine too closely, "It's not going to read itself." I looked up at her. My daughter. 32 years old, standing in my kitchen in East Nashville on a Saturday evening in September, with flour on the sleeve of her sweater and her gray-blue eyes watching me with an expression that was equal parts affectionate and exasperated, and something else underneath both of those things that I recognized, because I had felt it myself every day for the past 9 months. The particular quality of a feeling that has been waiting a very long time to exist, and is still slightly astonished to find itself real. I picked up the pie carefully and carried it to the dining room table and set it in the center, and did not say anything about it. I did not need to. Some things you carry forward not because they are resolved, but because they are yours. The years I had lost were mine. The years ahead were mine. The woman sitting across from me at the table, arguing cheerfully with Margaret about Nashville pie establishments, was mine in the only way that mattered, not by possession, but by the fact that we had chosen each other across 20 years of distance and deception, and managed against considerable odds to find our way to the same table. I looked around at the people in that room and thought about what it had taken to get us all here. Then I picked up my fork and cut into Sarah's pie. It was without question the best thing I had ever tasted. People sometimes ask me if I have regrets. I have 20 years of them, and I would carry every single one again if it led me back to that alley in Millbrook, to that moment to her. This is a grandpa story I never planned to tell, but family story or not, the truth has a way of finding daylight eventually, no matter how carefully someone buries it. I spent 2 decades building walls around my grief instead of doors. Do not do what I did. If something feels wrong, fight for it. Ask the hard question. Make the call you have been putting off. The people you love cannot wait for the right moment, because the right moment does not always come back around. I believe God kept that envelope in Ruth's apron pocket for 20 years. I believe He kept a green notebook at the bottom of a wooden chest. Some things are not coincidence. Some things are simply answered prayers that took longer than we expected. This family story changed everything I thought I knew about loss. These grandpa stories remind us it is never too late to find your way home. If this story moved, You leave a comment below and tell us which moment stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your sign. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted purely for meaningful educational storytelling. If that is not your preference, we completely respect that. Feel free to explore other content that speaks to you. We will see you in the next one.